illegal medicines. The way treaties affect international law is that in the Constitution there is a clause, and I can't cite it, I'm sorry, that says, they can implement the laws of nations, which means that if there is a treaty, the federal government has the power to enforce that treaty within our borders, and it gives them a power that they might not otherwise have under the Constitution. They are not presumed, however, to create enforceable rights in individuals except in certain circumstances. I'd like to read you a quote here from a case in 1931 of Santo Vincenzo versus Egan. The treaty-making power is broad enough to cover all subjects that properly pertain to our foreign relations and agreement with respect to the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States in foreign countries and of the nationals of such countries within the United States, and the disposition of the property of aliens dying within the territory of the respective parties is within the scope of that power. Now, this does not include treaties about how your citizens are going to behave. I think one can make an argument that the government does not have a right to sign a treaty that agrees with another nation what they're going to require from us. Another good description of treaty powers comes from a very famous case called the head money cases. And a treaty made by the United States with any foreign nation can become the subject of judicial cognizance in the courts of this country. It is subject to such acts of Congress may pass for its enforcement, modification, or repeal. This means that Congress does not always have to follow the treaty, and I'll say more about this later. But here's another example. In 1987, this country passed the Anti-Terrorism Act. And under that act, this was a statute, a U.S. statute, they wanted to close the headquarters, there was a headquarters for the Palestinian Liberation Organization by the UN. Remember, they were UN observers. They couldn't actually sit in the UN, but they could have an observing person there. Well, they tried to close that headquarters. And the Palestinians raised the issue of a treaty that was not clearly abrogated by the Anti-Terrorism Act. The court said Congress has the power to enact statutes abrogating prior treaties or international obligations entered into by the United States, quoting Whitney v. Roberts in 1988 and the head money cases. However, unless this power is clearly and unequivocally exercised, this court is under a duty to interpret statutes in a manner consonant with existing treaty obligations. That was in U.S. versus the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That's really where we are with drug prohibition. If Congress wanted to just get rid of it, stop arresting people, they have to deal with the single convention, which you're all familiar with, and I'll talk more about later, but they would have to clearly say, we are not following the single convention, which might be what, we'll hear happened in Europe, who also signed on to it. Some treaties are self-executing, meaning as soon as they try it as the law. Some of them require implementing legislation, such as the Controlled Substance Act. Now, I'd like to go back now to the history of the food and drug laws. In 1898, the first Food and Drug Act, which I talked about earlier, it stated that no person should, quote, sell, exchange, or deliver, or have in his custody or possession with the intent to sell or exchange any article or food or drug which is adulterated. And adulterated meant that it was not in the right strength or description that was found in the United States Pharmacopoeia. In 1906, this country signed a treaty called the Unification of Pharmacopoeia Treaty. And that treaty set forth specific required strengths of all the drugs and medicine. Again, there weren't very many back there. Well, bingo, what do you think happened next? That 1898 law that applied only in this District of Columbia and the territories now applied to the whole country. And that was the beginning of this terribly onerous agency called the Food and Drug Administration that we are dealing with today, not only in terms of cannabis, but in terms of our vitamins, cancer drugs, whatever we need, they don't want us to have. They made it a crime to introduce into interstate commerce any drug not in compliance with this Pharmacopoeia Treaty. Said it was much more likely to regulate commerce in This is what the treaty required. It was much more likely to regulate commerce in food and drugs with reference to plain matter of fact, so that food or drugs should be what they profess to be, when the kind was stated, than to describe the, I'm sorry, I didn't make my typo on my own notes here, the uses of its constitutional power to establish criteria and reasons where opinions were far apart. Okay. Cannabis prohibition. The history of cannabis prohibition is also interlaced with various multinational treaties. At one time, the prohibition against the sale or possession of an item, Congress wouldn't do it. In a case called U.S. versus DeWitt in 1870, that made it illegal to sell a particular type of illuminating oil, the Supreme Court said, no, you just can't do this. You don't have the power to do that. So they started to get around it with treaties. First one, as I said, 1906, where you couldn't sell or exchange any kind of adulterated drug product. In 1912 and 1913, there was a new treaty signed, and it was called the Suppression of Abuse of Opium and Other Drugs. It was signed and ratified in 1912. The treaty required that opium, morphine, and cocaine be regulated. Now, cannabis wasn't on that one. Very important point. There was no cannabis restriction at that point. The treaty provided that all contracted powers use their best efforts to control the commerce of morphine, cocaine, and their salts, and mandated accomplishing this by limited manufacture to authorized premises and demanding that all those who manufacture, import, or sell these substances be licensed. Well, this was followed, guess what, by the famous Harrison Act, December 17, 1914. And it required, to get around Doremus, they required that every person who produces, imports, manufactures, compounds, deals and dispenses, sells, distributes, or gives away opium or coca leaves, or any compound manufacture, salt derivative, or preparation thereof, shall register with the collector of internal revenue of the district. They put a tax on it. And that was held to be constitution. This was challenged in a case called U.S. versus Wong Sing in 1922. And the Wong Sing decision said that they could do this, whereas they couldn't do it as a possession, they could do it as a revenue measure. Am I okay on time? Speed up. Oh, okay, speed up. Okay. Hemp first appears in a treaty in 1925, the Geneva Convention, which was not signed by the United States. And, just got one page here. And that was followed, however, by the well-known 1938 Tax Act, which again got after the cannabis by putting, you had to have a stamp on it. If you didn't have a stamp, it was illegal. So it wasn't actually technically illegal to possess it. It was only illegal to possess it if you didn't have the stamp, which made it basically illegal to possess it because nobody could get the stamp. Kind of like the gun laws, just for your information. Now, all of these old treaties were superseded by the Single Convention of 1961, which this country entered into with, damn near all the, countries in Europe and many other countries as well. And following that, we have the Controlled Substance Act, which we live under today. Now, unlike the previous drug acts, which did it through a tax, they didn't need to do an end run around the Constitution. They were able to directly prohibit the possession or transfer distribution of all these different drugs. That was because the treaty is there. And every time the drug laws have been challenged, that treaty is brought up. A number of famous cases you might know about, Normal versus Ingersoll, where this very organization sued over it and won at sub-levels, and then this treaty was held up as a reason why we have to do this. However, there's a couple of escape clauses in that treaty that we need to point out when this comes up, say, in debates. One is there is an exception for medical use. Now, you are supposed to go back to the World Trade Organization type thing and get it approved if you're going to reschedule something, but you can get it approved. You can change it if you want. There's also a clause in there that says the penal provisions must be subject to the constitutional limitations. So you could get around the Single Convention if we were to make a finding that the private possession and use of cannabis or any other drug